All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. First and foremost, thank you all for joining today. My name is Marcelino Diaz. For those of you who don't know me, I graduated last year as part of the class of 2020. I graduated with a bachelor's in criminal justice, and I'm currently a graduate student in the School of Social Work. And I'll pass it over to Tyson for him to introduce himself.
How you guys doing? My name is Tyson Jones. I'm a current senior at Springfield College. I'm a sociology and psychology major. And on top of that, my involvement is I'm the treasurer of the Black Student Union here as well.
Professor Gallardo.
Sure. So my name is Roberto Gallardo. I'm a professor here at Springfield College. I'm in the criminal justice department. I focus on issues in policing as well. A lot of my research has to do with minority police officers and their experience within large municipal departments as well. And Marcelino asked me to join in on this, and I think it's a really great event to have a discussion about pretty important issues.
Thank you, Dr. Gibbons.
Yes. Good evening. My name is John Gibbons. I'm currently the United States Marshal for the District of Massachusetts. I've been in law enforcement policing for 41 plus years. Prior to my service with the United States Marshal Service, I served as a Massachusetts State Police officer for over 30 years. Most of my career was in the Division of Investigations with the Massachusetts State Police, and I served as a unit commander of the Northwestern District Attorney's Office, served as a unit commander also of the Massachusetts State Attorney General's Office, and served in various roles as a task force supervisor on the Western Mass Gang Task Force, served as a supervisor in organized crime, as well as I had some other roles as a fire marshal representative and an expert in fires, and served also as a crisis negotiator for the state police. In 2009, at the end of 2009, I was appointed United States Marshal by President Barack Obama. I was confirmed by the full Senate on December 24th, 2009, appointed by President Obama on the 28th of December, and I started in my role January 4th, 2010 as the United States Marshal, and I'm still sitting in that role. I'm a graduate of American International College, undergrad degree, graduate degree, and I received my doctorate degree last year, December of 2019. Just would like to also say, born and raised in Newark, New Jersey. Was a good student athlete, came to Massachusetts, was a good student athlete, and while I was in graduate school, I started my role in the criminal justice system with the Hamden County Sheriff's Department as a correctional counselor, part-time, and then started in a role as a full-time correctional counselor, and then I went on to the state police. So first of all, I want to just thank Professor Gallardo, Marcelino, and also Tyson for inviting me to participate in this forum tonight, and look forward to engaging and collaborating.
Thank you. The list of titles in which you hold, are truly amazing, and it shows the experience in which you have under your belt. So the reason that we're having this event today is to focus on the racial injustices that continuously occur with police officers, and time and time again, we're seeing new headlines of police brutality and Black and brown individuals being killed by the hands of police officers. And the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor this past summer sparked many protests nationwide. as well as many others. And as recently as yesterday, Walter Wallace Jr. Was killed and shot and killed by police officers in Philly. So it's important to recognize, oppression where we're alive. And over the summer, the Division of Inclusion and Community Engagement has hosted its weekly meetings on race. And while the first one was very well attended, throughout time, unfortunately, the numbers started to grow smaller and smaller. And it's important to recognize also that, most of the time when we're having these conversations, it's always the same people in the room, and it's those people who know what's happening and who are already educated on it. And I couldn't help but notice while attending those meetings, there is very few engagement from criminal justice professors or students here at Springfield College. So that was disappointing to say the least, but I'm glad to see that there's 90 something people here today. And we're hoping for a great event. Tyson?
Just as well, we do understand that people may not have personal experiences having issues with police, but there are still systemic problems that have been going on for centuries in the United States and that have led to issues for people of color for centuries now. And also we do understand as well, people may have family that are police officers, and none of this is coming at anybody individually, and we respect everyone's opinions in this matter. We love to hear back if you guys can speak.
Okay, so it's important to recognize, to dive into a little bit about the history of policing before we could begin to understand how policing takes form currently and the direction that we could move in later on. But to kind of pinpoint how policing came about, it first started as slave patrol back in the 1700s in South Carolina, and those the slave patrol, the goals within them were to chase down, apprehend, and return slaves to their slave owners, as well as to provide a form of organized terror to deter slaves from having some sort of rebellion, and to maintain forms of discipline for the slave workers who violated any rules. And that's kind of what sparked policing. And Tyson, you could speak more about kind of what came about afterwards.
Yeah, and then after that post-Civil War, the slave patrols ended. So that you would think necessarily that black people would be safer and be free, and people of color would be freer. But what had happened was you had things like the Black Codes and Jim Crow that basically essentially they were still enslaved. They just didn't really have that title. They still couldn't vote. They still couldn't have a well-paying job to sustain a family, and they were still stuck working these sharecropper type of jobs. And really policing it with these Jim Crow and the Black Codes, if you got out of line, you could end up dead sometimes for not obeying these laws without repercussions to the police officers.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Frank.
I like that. Just add one thing. I know, and I'll bring up the U.S. Marshal Service back in 1850, due to the fugitive slave law of the 1850 Marshal Service, and we're not happy about our past of enforcing that act by going out arresting fugitive slaves and then returning them to their southern masters. But later on, the Marshal Service in the 60s, we were given authority and through President John F. Kennedy to go and, for instance, Ruby Bridges, a young lady who had to be escorted to her elementary school in New Orleans, the U.S. Marshals were tasked with that responsibility. There is a pain, the problem we all live with by Norman Rockwell, and that's highlighted in that. And then also in 1962, President Kennedy and Attorney General Robert Kennedy gave the Marshals the responsibility to escort James Meredith to the University of Mississippi, along with other students, and also to the University of Alabama. So, we were, the Marshal Service, in those times, we were there to be helpful, and we've been doing that ever since. The other thing I wanted to bring up, early policing, blacks weren't allowed to become police officers. And it's not until probably maybe the late 50s, I would say the late 50s, that one or two individuals were allowed on police departments. And we had difficulty on those police departments. And I'll just bring up one individual, Samuel Range. He was a Massachusetts State Police officer. In 1956, the year I was born, Samuel Range became the first African-American Massachusetts State Police officer. But Samuel Range and I sat down and we talked about it. He only lasts 3 years because of racism and all the abuse he took. So these are several, I just want to highlight some of those things.
Perfect. So I'll actually go a little bit into some of the general ideas about kind of what they label as the eras of policing from very early on, just to kind of complement whatever everyone has said so far. So again, started slave patrol, kind of the unofficial form. Again, once you get into actual, municipal departments and policing, then you get into, again, didn't look like it looks like today, right? So a lot of local governments had a lot more power, meaning the officers were this is called like the political era, essentially. And a lot of the officers there were pretty much the enforcers for the political parties, the local political parties, right? So obviously, as Dr. Gibbons talked about, well, minorities were not a part of this particular grouping at this time. I forgot to mention, right after the Civil War, during the Reconstruction era, there was actually more representation at this point. But however, once Jim Crow and segregation laws came into play, then it was pretty much eliminated again. It went pretty much back to 0% of minority officers around the country. And even then, if there were some, especially with African-American officers, they weren't even full officers many of the time. There was occasions where they couldn't wear uniforms, they couldn't arrest or work with white officers as well. They couldn't arrest anybody who wasn't African-American at this point. Couldn't move up into positions of management, which unfortunately kind of still continues today, even if it's unofficial. And so that was the first kind of era when it comes to the political era. Well, that is obviously very problematic if we're talking about, local governments kind of, using the police as kind of their own security force, essentially. This led into something called the Reform era, which is exactly what it sounds like, reforming back into a more, what they call professional service, right? So more of the police service that you know today to some extent, right? So things like having a non-political nature to an extent, having standards as well that are pretty universal in some sense, at least for local departments and into different departments around the country. Starting to hire a little bit more of, at least the attempt on paper was to make things equal, right? But something that, in general, that's kind of looked at as a great movement in terms of, making police more of a professional component of society. But one of the problems is that even when it comes to representation, right? So we're talking, 40s into the 60s, essentially, at this point. There were still now officers had, you couldn't say, hey, I'm not going to hire you because you're a minority, but it's like, hey, you didn't reach this particular goal or this particular number we have on this exam. So it was kind of like another hurdle, essentially, at this point. And then later on in the future, you look at things like even furthering up in terms of going into managerial positions and requiring a college degree, where this wasn't necessarily the case before in many departments around the country. And so kind of these unofficial hurdles essentially that are built at a certain point. Later on into the early 90s, a lot of the professional movement, a lot of use of force, unfortunately, went to a lot of the riots in the 60s, the 80s, and even I remember the Rodney King beating in Los Angeles. I'm originally from California in Los Angeles, and the idea of this isn't necessarily a new thing, right? So that's also kind of something that we'll get into later on about contemporary policing. I mean, this has been going on, as far as we can remember. Essentially now, just the easier access to things like social media and everyone having a phone in their hand, able to record this and bring awareness to this. But there was some kind of reform as well, going into things like community policing, where the professional movement, what would happen is use more technology as well, and so you have police officers in again, not really on foot anymore, but in police cars, right? And you still have that today, so there's a lot less interaction with the community. So the idea with the new form of community policing is that you have the officers in certain areas and they know the community, where they form relationships to some extent. Again, this is all in theory, right? That's the big thing. You still have a lot of disconnect from the community, right? The research that I do with the LAPD, a lot of the officers that are in Los Angeles County don't actually even live within the city limits, and are able to live in other areas that are a lot less in crime, more middle class or class areas, and not the areas that they police as well. So I want to just stop there again in general, just to just talk about a little bit how the eras of policing have kind of existed in the United States. And the other thing, kind of the last thing I'll talk about this, at least from a historical perspective, is that as these eras kind of change, especially from professionalism into more representation of officers today, even though it's still highly disproportionate. And this is, one of the reasons people claim that this is potentially why, the use of force, if you're talking about, let's say, what happened with Ferguson several years ago, you're looking at, Ferguson, Missouri, which was close to 65% African American, and the police department was 95% white. So unfortunately, that's more common than not in the United States at this point. But it's always been this transition of it wasn't an evolutionary kind of thing. It wasn't like one after another. They were all kind of changed by, I call it changed by force or necessity. Lawsuits, Department of Justice, what are called consent decrees as well, where it basically says, we're going to watch over you until you kind of get your stuff straight, essentially. And this is more common than not, right? So it's not necessarily these big transitions that are, out of the goodness. I mean, not to sound bad, but out of the goodness of people's hearts. It's essentially the idea of by necessity, essentially. So I'll stop there because we'll go into contemporary policing. Does anybody want to speak on contemporary policing, or should I?
Also, I want to add, it's looking back at the long history of policing and how race plays a factor into it. There's no avoiding, the status of, regardless of if you're an individual going into policing with the right mindset, or if you're a person that believes, I want to make a change in a system that's broken. Policing is inherently racist, and people are going to have their views on that. But moving forward and looking at how policing is organized today, we need to ask these questions as to how does implicit bias play a factor in police departments. What goes into an officer's mind when they go into a low income neighborhood, one in which we see a lot of police brutality within those neighborhoods at home. So Professor Gallardo, could you add to that and talk more about racial bias and talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to quickly clear up something that Marcelino said that is accurate, but I kind of want to put it in a greater context. So he talked about policing in itself is, like a racist institution. And what I mean by that is not necessarily that the individual people within them are, out to discriminate, in an obvious kind of form. But, one of the things that I talk about is that change within police departments comes very, very slowly. By design, because the institution of policing as a whole isn't meant to create change. It's it is to keep the status quo as it is, right? It's there to enforce the law, whatever those laws may be. If it's, in the 1950s, or, it could be segregation laws, right? It could be, any of these other things that we have in the history of this country, right? So when Marcelino says it's the institution of policing as a whole is racist, it's basically keeping the system as it is, right? So, we talk about this a lot. I used to talk about this in my classes, where it's just part of the system as a whole, right? You have to not looking at it necessarily in isolation, but how policing exists in the rest of the country as well, and why it exists in the way it does, right? Now, there's many different, theories and ideas about why this is the case, which again is not necessarily the reasoning rationale behind this, but I want to, kind of quickly discuss some of the ideas of why this happens or how this developed, right? And this kind of goes back to what I talked about briefly about the eras of policing and the professional movement, right? So making things more professional. One of the things that happened there is that a police culture was developed, like a subculture. The idea being that, different from the rest of society. And again, we're talking about an institution that has been predominantly white and male over the course of the history. Again, still predominantly over white and male. And so you have this culture that develops like an inside-outside culture, an us versus them kind of thing, looking at critics as being the enemy, essentially, right? And again, you have to look at it, again, I like to look at things from different perspectives, and the idea is, how they view their occupation as being potentially really dangerous. Now, whether that's accurate or not, again, the numbers kind of say, well, it's not as dangerous as you might think it is. I mean, if you look at it in terms of the officers that have died in the line of duty from like homicide within the last 20 years, it's probably if I remember the numbers, it's about the same as to the died during car accidents or other type of motorcycle accidents and things like that. But again, it's the perception of danger, which is important, right? And more specifically, things like who is a threat and who is not a threat, right? So I just want to bring that up when we talk about, the institution as being inherently racist. It's just part of the country as a whole, I would say, right? Now, again, you can kind of make the extensions there. And again, not necessarily in overt fashion as well, right? So again, when we talk about, Marcel said about, things like implicit bias and, a lot of these things that aren't as obvious anymore, right? Well, historically, when we talk about discriminatory things, well, they exist in police departments just like they did across the country, right? If we're talking about, again, I do research on the LAPD just because it's one of these big, gigantic departments that, has a pretty shady history, right? If you kind of followed it even fairly recently. But, they, didn't hire females. When they talked about, expanding the minimum height requirement, there was a lot of pushback against that. So the idea would be that you can hire more women and more minority officers. This is one of these changes that happen over time, but not in an evolutionary sense. So there's stereotypes that exist, right? So the way, police officers look at these things, they categorize things in terms of, like I said, who's a threat, who's not a threat. And these stereotypes in terms of, I talk about in my classes, well, who's a criminal? Picture in your mind right now a criminal. Do most people picture, let's say, a white male in a suit carrying a briefcase? Probably not, right? Do they think of white-collar crime? Well, probably not. They think of, drugs and usually minority males or minority individuals in, let's say, urban environments, right? And, that might not, depending on where you are, right? But, think about how it's depicted in the media as well. And the influence that could potentially have on, officers and whether, split-second decisions or, giving citations or arrests and, those things related to that. I always talk about it's not one particular officer or very overt things, but it's things that exist in a contemporary way that may not appear as obvious, especially if you don't have experience with them, definitely. I'll pause there. I'm talking a lot.
Right. That was great. And I also want to add, and then I'll let Dr. Gibbons speak. A lot of the times, like currently, we're hearing a lot of people say, there needs to be more implicit bias training within the police department, which I think that's accurate. I think there needs to be more of that, but it can't just stop there. We need to go into unpacking what that means. Everyone has some kind of bias in life. Even the most perfect person in this world is biased towards some things. And unless you're able to figure out what your own biases are and what kind of triggers those, what triggers you, then you're not going to be able to go into a specific situation and be able to maintain control over your own instincts. But I'll leave that there. And Dr. Gibbons, could you speak more about what modern day policing kind of looks like right now, and as somebody who is a U.S. Marshal high in the ranking, that.
Well, first of all, I want to just touch base on the implicit bias training, since it's right on our minds right now. But I know across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, a lot of the departments, and I say across the country because I'm in meetings across the country. I'm in with several police associations, leadership associations. So there is implicit bias training going. It just has to be continued on an annual basis. Also, and there's been some recommendations, de-escalation training. Coupled with that, there's been a lot of talk of that since the recent George Floyd incident. And I know I'm a member of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. And a lot of the memberships in the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Enforcement Executives, a lot of the membership, we have members that are head of large police departments. Philadelphia, you have the young lady, matter of fact, she was on TV this morning about a shooting, but she's a member. You have several other members that have large departments. William Gross is Boston PD, but we're all members. And these are some of the things that we have recommended. More implicit bias training, to be consistent and have annual training, and then also to have de-escalation training, as well as health and mental and health wellness and mental wellness training too, because the police profession is under a lot of stress. The officers are under a lot of stress, federal and state and local. But we also need that health wellness, because we need to not only take care of ourselves, we got to take care of the community. We got to be there for the community. So if we're not well, how can we do our job effectively? So that is, I wanted to touch base on that before I forget about implicit bias training. It is going on. I know the leadership of the U.S. Marshal Service, also the leadership of the FBI. A couple years ago, we all had to go to Washington, D.C., and we sat in classrooms for a couple days on implicit bias training. And just some of the things that we picked up, and some of the things that people weren't aware of. So it's important. It's important to continue that ongoing training as well. That professional, because you wanna be a better person, a better professional. So therefore, you need that ongoing professional training. In regards to today, policing. You had this situation that was a bad mark on police. It was horrible what happened to George Floyd. It was on video camera, and I'm glad it was captured on video camera. I'm glad it was captured. I'm glad that these individuals are brought to court. Hopefully that we will see this all through. This is the community and law enforcement in it together, because us as law enforcement leaders denounce this type of behavior. So law enforcement today, we're here to work with the communities. I say today, law enforcement, there were a lot of good things being done. But then you have something like this that caused a whole problem, and it causes mistrust. And therefore, with law enforcement today, we have to now win that trust back over. And with law enforcement today, we need to sit down and listen to the community. Now, we're talking police reform. We agree there should be some police reform, we as leaders. And we need to sit at the table and collaborate with the community. The community has to have some input on how we are going to police. We need to hear from the community. So we got to be active listeners. And a lot of that is going on right now in various communities. I know here in Massachusetts, there's ongoing conversation and talks with the community in Springfield. There are ongoing talks in Boston and throughout the country. We just have to sit down and listen. And then we just have to, bottom line is we have to work as a team with the community.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Absolutely accurate by Dr. Gibbons. I just want to kind of give an overview or a big idea in terms of the implicit bias, and so there's different ways of attacking this, right? And I mean in the sense of the implicit bias training is definitely very useful, and it focuses on the individuals who may be in the streets and make them aware, obviously, of things that they may not be aware of, right? Which is absolutely great. I tend to focus on things from a macro perspective, I would say. So kind of the structure, right? So how does the individual person fit within the structure of policing, and what that means. In doing a lot of the research that I do, there's a lot of the idea that the culture of policing potentially has an influence on a lot of what's happening necessarily, right? So like the norms that are established, or kind of this cultural component of what even the role of a police officer is, right? So depending on who you talk to, this can vary by race, it can vary by sex, right? And again, if you look at this from the perspective of, if you ask people why they want to be police officers, the overwhelming majority of people who want to be officers say, well, they want to help people. That's the overwhelming reason. And, that's absolutely accurate. I believe that to be true. And they really believe that, and they, do their jobs in order to do this exact same thing. And also, again, their perception of what police officers, what it's actually like, the perceived danger, and so on. And how this is kind of also varied. Again, so like I said, a lot of the research that I do is on minority officers. And so, I talk to minority officers and I ask them the same thing as well. Like, why do you want to become an officer? And a lot of people would say helping people as well, like as a general crew. But a lot of them would actually get more specific. They say, well, I want to help the community. I want to help my community. I want to help the same community that I came from. And they'll talk, tell me stories about, when they were, younger, and, they might have been troublemakers or something. And, might have had negative interactions with police officers or heard about more specifically from other people about, interactions that may have happened in the community. And, they say, well, I want to be that person that helps my community and to receive, very similar or equal services as everyone else, what they believe is going on. And I think that's very helpful in that sense. But the reason, again, I go back to the cultural component is that from a positive sense, this is all great. But from a negative cultural component, there's many negative cultural components to policing that, kind of hinder this reform process. So like the idea of, a code of silence, if you've ever heard this idea of like, like the officers, the stories that I've, talked to, the idea of like, you don't really, say too much, something to incriminate an officer, especially like, you do cover, yourself and you do everything from a legal standard, but there's certain cultural elements that can be problematic, right? I mean, even the basic idea is there even a problem, right? So Dr. Gibbons, talked about the fact that, at the very high levels, there's absolutely perception of a problem. But if you ask, Officer Joe, you may say, no, it's overblown, we're just being attacked, and so on. And this is where it becomes, that disconnect from, the officers who encounter the population versus, management, essentially. And again, as Dr. Gibbons talked about, this is a very stressful occupation, right? Whether, the perceived danger or not. And, unfortunately, there is these things where it's, the use of force. And even though it's still pretty rare, especially, deadly force, but, it is, something, one is too many, essentially, is the case, or as we're talking about here. And, I just want to briefly talk about, when George Floyd happened, again, doing this research and, seeing stuff that's happened before, you can name the names and, you've had, slight demonstrations and so on, but they've kind of, gone up in popularity and then, kind of dipped down until, unfortunately, the next event happens. And with George Floyd, again, this kind of brought issues to the forefront, not necessarily people who've experienced it, but, people who maybe weren't aware of these things going on in our country. And that's understandable. And I mean that in the sense of like, if you have family members who are police officers, and I'm assuming they're great people and you know them and so on, right? So you're like, well, how can, people believe, this is going on with officers? But at the same time, you have to remember that, again, we're not talking about the individual people, we're talking about the institution as a whole. And, if you've only had positive interactions with police officers, then, then yeah, I mean, you view them as, very positive. But if you've only had negative, experiences or heard other people on their negative experiences with them, well, you're probably going to have a different perspective on them. And each one is essentially valid with their own experience. But it could be something else very different than what someone else is experiencing. And I think that's one of the big disconnects that happens today. I was, again, reading a poll about from the Pew Research Center a couple of years ago that was talking about, different perception on, of police brutality based on race. And again, with minority members of society, not having as much confidence in police officers as, white males and females in the country. And again, kind of a little bit of what I went into, why the personal experience with officers and the perception of it as well. So again, with the George Floyd component, again, this is the last thing I'll talk about this before we go into like the future of policing and things like that, is that one of the reasons that I believe this became one of these issues in society is because I think it kind of awoke with the images and the video that we've seen. There was no like rational explanation for doing this, right? And I think people actually seeing these stories and, believing it from the perspective of, unfortunately, this individual who, lost his life because of this, and seeing this as something that is not just, someone claiming that it happened, but actually seeing it and making it real, essentially. And I think, people unfortunately respond to things like that where, like I said, this is becoming more common, not in the sense of police brutality, but the sense of recording it, making it more visible, right? I go back to the Rodney King riots in the early 1990s. If you're not familiar with this, Rodney King was in a vehicle and got pulled over, and he was resisting arrest, what they called. And there was, 4 officers constantly beat him with the clubs and hit him upwards of broken bones and over 40 times or so. And one of the things that happened is that members from the community stated that this wasn't necessarily something new. The only thing that was new essentially was that it was video recorded. I mean, literally with the old school kind of, tapes and the thing. And that this has been in the community, minority communities for years and years and years, but there is now just a face to it, very similar with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and all these other people. There's now face to these ideas and these things that happen in society. So like I said, I'll stop there. If anybody else wants to speak about the topic.
Before we move on, I want to go back because I missed a question that Sarah Friedman had asked. She said, do you think that implicit bias should be commonly taught in schools and when children are growing up? Yeah, absolutely. A lot of these issues that are occurring are a result of generational events. And a lot of things that we learn, is a result of what the conversations we have with our parents, our mentors growing up in the classroom. And these things are very prevalent. And I know me myself, I've never once had a conversation about race or policing up until this year probably. But the school system within itself is an issue. The school to prison pipeline is a thing that exists, and unfortunately, it funnels kids into the criminal justice system at far too young of an age, and that leaves a huge influence on them growing up, to where once they're involved within the system, it's likely that things may continue to perpetuate as life goes on, and the prisons within the criminal justice system, they actually look at a third grade reading level to dictate how many beds they should put into a prison. And I don't know about anybody else, but that seems really disheartening to base like whether or not somebody's going to end up in prison by third grade. But yeah, that was a great question. And we'll continue to answer more questions. I'm sorry. Did somebody speak? Okay. Yeah, we'll continue to answer questions later on. Towards the end, we'll have a Q&A where people can ask questions. But moving forward, looking at what we could do now and like what the future of policing looks like and what some of the solutions are. Me as a person of color, Tyson, many other people on here, I'm sure we have some idea as to what we would like to see happen. Dr. Gibbons, could you speak more about kind of the direction in which we're going in as a society?
Well, first of all, I think there should be some diversity and inclusion in these police departments. I think we need to increase that diversity and inclusion. More minority officers, need more female officers, black officers, Hispanic, Oriental, or I would say Asian officers. We have to, our departments, police departments have to be representative of the communities that we serve. And, as you notice, throughout the United States, our communities are very diverse. So we need some representation. We need people also, as Dr. Gallardo, Professor Gallardo mentioned, we need people who are members of the community. So recruitment is key. Recruitment for these police agencies are key. We have to find the right people, the right person with the right temperament, the right demeanor. People who will treat other individuals with dignity and respect. People that have good character. And once we recruit these individuals, we have to train them properly. And not only do we train them properly in the academy, but we also continue to train them when they come out on their, usually it's a probation period, but also it's a period where a field training officer takes that individual, and that individual rides with a field training officer. And that field training officer should be someone that has high standards in their police department, good character, so they can train them well. So those are some of the things. I think recruitment is key. That's the beginning of it. Finding the right person that will fit with the community, that will be empathetic, concerned about the community, about doing their job, serving the community, serve and protect. That's what we do, and that's what we need to find individuals, and intense background checks also on those individuals. I say it, and I've sat on oral boards before. If we see any flaws or issues stemming from an oral interview or background investigation, we have to stop and thoroughly follow up and investigate that individual's character. At this point, we cannot just bring anybody on these police departments. So I emphasize it once again, recruitment, that is key. Continuous training is key. And then also, I will say one thing as part of our training, also, we gotta train individuals who will, if they see something that is not correct out there, and we have to teach this right in the academy, and once we get them into field training. If there is something questionable about how the senior officer is, or an officer is treating an individual, member of the community, not treating them properly, you need to step in. You need to intervene. And I know that is part of some of the reform they're working on. And I think this reform is going to mandate that police officers do something. Because in the George Floyd situation, those officers that were with him did nothing.
Professor Gallardo would like to add?
Yeah. Dr. Gibbons is right. Hits around the nose. Like the idea of accountability related to that. So, like they said with the George Floyd incident, like no one reported anything. Within the officers that anything happened. So I go back to the Rodney King beating in the early '90s. Same thing. I mean, you had this on video, but nobody reported anything out of the ordinary. And again, if you watch this video, it's terrible. You see the amount of physical force that is used for this particular individual. I go back to that story specifically because the brother of Rodney King, the person who received the speeding, he tried to put a complaint with the department, and they never accepted it. And it wasn't until the actual video came out that it became big news essentially, and eventually led to further demonstrations, and later on into again what they label as the riots of the early '90s. I believe there's even a documentary on Netflix about it if you're interested about that. But Dr. Gibbons also talked about representation and diversity, and absolutely, this is, if you're talking about the future of policing, you have to look at the future of the United States in general, right? If we start with basic things like the population, well, the population is diversified, right? The big number we have today is 2050, and the idea that by 2050 or so, there will be no racial or ethnic group in the United States that has a majority, meaning 50% of the population. So we're talking about different, Asian, Latino, Hispanic, all these different groups increasing in numbers. So the idea is that they have to be representative, at least departments should be somewhat representative of their jurisdiction, the people that they police as well. Should be from the community, to understand the community, to know, what are the major issues, to know, just people in general. Some of the research that I've done with Latino officers, they talk about, I ask them a simple question of, how does it some type of advantage, or does it help you at all? And the officers will say, well, yeah, I've had times where, I have a victim who is, unable, let's say an immigrant, or, maybe is uncomfortable speaking to a particular officer, and, them being the same race or ethnicity, and you can just, they say literally, you can see in their face that as soon as, they start speaking Spanish, or, say that they're from the community or anything like that, that their whole demeanor changes, and they're a lot more relaxed and a lot more willing to share information, and a lot more willing, to basically see beyond the badge, see beyond the institution, which unfortunately they might fear, and see the person, right? Which I think would be really, really helpful. So not only representation at the lower levels, which is happening across the country a little bit more with the NYPD, Chicago, Milwaukee, and LAPD, and different places around the country, but also as Dr. Gibbons talked about with the field training officers, and even further on with sergeants and captains. The representation seems to dip a lot within larger departments in terms of managerial positions, as we like to call them. So you might have, representative groups in, let's say, LA, Chicago, and New York, somewhat around the same thing as, the jurisdiction essentially, but, the people in charge, unfortunately are, not as representative as you would like, whether it comes to sex, and or race or ethnicity, and that could potentially be a problem as well. I go back to an unfortunate story that happened in Los Angeles several years ago, where an officer believed he was treated unfairly, and ended up actually using force on other officers. It was a national story, and one of the things that he talked about was that again, I go back to the LAPD as a pretty terrible history. And he said that a lot of people that were involved in these terrible actions before, with the Rodney King beating, later on with the Rampart scandal in terms of planting weapons and all these other things, and was that they didn't necessarily get fired, they just got promoted, and that's an unfortunate thing. Like, again, that comes back to a structure and a cultural thing, again, which is the last thing I'll talk about from how do we kind of fix this, or the future of policing. There's a lot of talk about defunding the police and what exactly that means, right? So, and I think, again, not necessarily taking away resources from officers, but taking resources and putting them in the community, right? And putting them where this is necessary in order to reduce crime in general, because we got a pretty good idea when it comes to structural explanations of crime, and what helps people, follow the law and not commit crime in general, right? And so we should kind of invest in the community that potentially view the solution. Obviously, representation is very, very important. And again, starting at kind of the root of the causes as well, the cultural component, and again, society as a whole, I think, needs to take a good look at understanding that these problems aren't brand new. They're just, I guess, more in the news now, and more polarized, but they've existed, unfortunately, as long as this country has existed. So I guess we start there.
Great. I want to add before we open up to questions. As an institution that prides itself on leadership and service to others, it's important for not just criminal justice professionals, but for all people going into the workforce, post grad, that when we're serving the community, when we're serving others, we can't pick and choose who we want to serve. We got to be there for all people, and check your own biasness, or check your own bias, check your own privilege, and make sure that we're doing our part in making the world a better place. And we start by self-educating yourself, going to events such as this one, and all the other ones that are being held this week. But yeah. So we'll get into questions now. If you have a question, you could just message or send a message to Ben Morales, just of your name and he'll kind of organize the order in which we go for questions.
Marcel, we have one here. How can we check an employee's baggage they bring to the job? Police, teacher, social worker, counselors, all human service workers.
So I think that goes back into doing those trainings that kind of pinpoints bias. I don't know so much about whether or not we could dig deep into their own history. I mean, there's background checks. Dr. Gibbons, you could speak about that. But I think it's so much as doing a report on the person, and the person being truthful when applying for jobs.
And thorough background checks will probably be done by the Human Resource Division of the various components that are hiring that individual. I know in law enforcement we do intensive background checks, and I know especially on the federal level they're checking everything. On the state level, I was with the state police. We check almost everything, credit records and everything, and then you follow up on those different things. So in regards to a background check, and I think a lot of, I talk to security in a lot of these businesses, as well as schools, and I think they're doing more and more thorough background checks.
Thank you. Ben?
And he's referring to background checks, right?
Ben just told me to unmute and ask my question. So hello. Thank you all for being here. I have a question for any of you, your thoughts on this, because I understand there might be a generational difference in thoughts on this. My question is, how do you see police officers and departments fitting into a model of restorative justice and practices? And do you include restorative justice and practices into your vision for police reform?
Dr. Gallardo, you want to answer that?
Yeah. So I'll get started with that. So again, when we talk about restorative justice, just to kind of talk about that for people who aren't aware, it's basically the idea of, instead of taking people out of the community, let's say with incarceration or anything like that, you kind of have programs and services within the community that would keep people within the community, right? So one of the things that unfortunately happens is when people get incarcerated is they leave the community. So you're kind of leaving the community from not only people but resources, things like that. I think when it comes to restorative justice, it has to be, right? But this goes into a really complex issue when it comes to things like discretion, officer discretion, right? So officers, they do have some discretion when it comes to these things, right?
Yes.
And it also means something like, changing these laws. So me and Dr. Gibbons and everyone here were talking about things like the war on drugs and things like mandatory minimums that existed, right? So even if these have obviously changed a little bit over the years, but these are things that had a huge impact in taking people out of the community, right? Especially for nonviolent drug offenses. And think about the differences of how we view that now in terms of, let's say, a rehabilitative problem, or something that is doesn't necessarily need incarceration, and the impact that could potentially have within the community in many different forms. But in general, I would say, you need that, definitely. And again, that's a different approach to the community and policing in general. How to accomplish that, I'm not too certain, to be honest, but it's definitely, maybe like we talked about a little bit before, through defunding, or more specifically, I like to call it like funding the community a little bit more through these services and things like that, that would hopefully, make the community safer, make it a better place to be, keep people within them, keep them away, as Marcelo talked about, the school to prison pipeline, things like that, most definitely.
And I'll just say I've seen on the juvenile level prior to me leaving the state police. I wouldn't say restorative justice, but it was programs where they would come in and I guess the court will run some type of intervention program. And instead of sentencing these children to the juvenile facility, they would do some type of intervention. And then that would, of course, that came with some type of probation, supervisory probation. And you just continue that over a certain period of time. I have read about restorative justice. I know in some other countries they are doing that. That's maybe something that's coming along with reform down the road. Thank you.
Did that answer your question, Sharice?
Yes, that's great. Thank you all so much.
Ben, would you like to go ahead and call on someone else?
He said I could unmute. Good evening, everyone. I had a question for Dr. Gibbons. Thank you for being here. When you spoke about trainings, I was wondering if police officers have a certain requirement of professional development trainings that are mandatory, like teachers. I'm a teacher myself, so I know the ins and outs of the TESI website and the requirements that teachers are forced to take such certain trainings every year. And then what are those requirements, and how is the U.S. Marshal Department following up with the departments if they're meeting those training requirements, if there are some?
Okay, and I'll speak on both. State police have requirements, yearly requirements. You go into an in-service program. You got to get your in-service program completed. The same thing with the local police. I think now with this police reform, I think it's going to be more of a certification type of effort. And I talked to like my colleagues from like North Carolina. Their police, they have certifications where they are licensed. I know in this state we are not licensed, but we go through those certifications. And I'm sorry, not certain. Well, we go through those programs and we make sure we get those programs complete. If you don't get the programs completed, I mean, you face some disciplinary process. And it's the same with the Marshal Service. Even myself, we have programs to complete in a timely manner. And we have to fulfill those things, or else, you might be, you may be disciplined, you may be getting, of course, you might get something written reprimand from me. So we make sure the supervisors, they make sure everyone, they report back to the chief deputy or myself, make sure everybody is all set. So that's how we monitor those things. But we also have a date and a time when we need to get this stuff done. Now, you just reminded me, I completed some training and they sent it to me and said that I have to complete this training. So I got to now backtrack and tell them I already completed the training and I have my certificate. So, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gibbons.
Yes. I see. Dr. Pickron asked what type of training. We go through firearms training. We go through use of force training. We go to CPR. I I just took my CPR training as well as my first aid training. We have to do that on a yearly basis. I know with the Marshal Service, we go to training in regards to cyber training. We have to keep up insider threat training. So there's a list of trainings that we go through. Every month I'm getting notified and I have to complete my training, along with also running the office as well as also dealing with all the other issues. And we tell our guys, we know they're busy, people are traveling, people are out on investigations. We do international travel, but you just got to get your stuff complete.
Thank you. Ben, I guess you could go ahead and call on someone for the next question.
That also told me I could unmute myself. I was pretty shocked when Marcel said that the first time he had a conversation in the criminal justice program about race and policing was this year as a second semester senior. When we talked about policing is inherently racist, I was wondering if maybe the faculty or people who manage the program have thought about introducing this earlier and more in depth within the major and minor.
Professor Gallardo?
I mute myself. Personally in my classes, that's pretty much all I can speak of. So in the actual curriculum itself, so there is a particular course on like gender, race, and crime, right? But for my particular courses, what I like to do is I like to bring in this information as well. So for example, I do teach Marcelo, the way I got to know Marcelino is he was in my class for research methods, right? So just how to do research. Not really having anything to do with race, but I brought in issues that way to so people can understand and make it, just a general conversation, this is why, some of these conversations can be uncomfortable for many people, right? But if you just kind of, make it open and honest and, as we are today, very, I would say very, it's just a conversation that needs to be done essentially. I try to include race in all my classes, right? In the criminology course, I bring it in as much as I possibly can. Even a course, what was it, a couple semesters ago, I actually taught a course on a lot of these critical issues on policing, and we actually spent a lot of time talking about race, and more specifically from an empirical perspective, the actual research and the numbers that have been done, and so we can look at it from that perspective instead of whatever our emotions are or what we feel might be going on. And we had people in there with different perspectives and views, but that was actually the best part, right? Because essentially you're having this conversation in a space that that allows you to have this, which unfortunately with like the rest of society, I don't think it's really the case, right? You do surround yourself with people who are very similar to you, whether consciously or unconsciously, and with similar views as well. And again, you don't necessarily have to agree with people's views, and I certainly don't. But maybe to understand and view the human nature, or I would say not the human nature, but the humanity in people, I think would be a good start as well. But again, going back to your question, I try to include it as much as possible in pretty much every single course that I can. And I'm assuming other professors in the criminal justice system or criminal justice program are probably trying to do as much as possible, at least particularly today when it's it's in the news and it's one of these major topics that we need to focus on in the department as well, for sure.
Yeah, and I can add to that also. So I'm actually a grad student now. So I haven't taken criminal justice classes, I think for the past 2 years or so. So I don't know so much about what they're doing now. But at least for when I was in Professor Gallardo's class, we talked about race to the extent in which our research was on. But dating back to elementary school, I've never actually had a teacher prepare a lesson plan on race, which I think is what a lot of students need. regardless of, whether you're teaching classes filled with BIPOC students or students who are all white. This is something that all people need to be taught. But yeah, hopefully now that things are starting to become more prevalent and people are starting to become more aware of these issues, that those conversations take place in the classrooms a lot more. Again, I like Professor Gallardo said, the goal is for it to be talked about in every class, but I guess it's up to the professor's discretion and how they can relate it back to the material being taught.
My name's Kurt Asherman. I'm the class of 71, a member of the Board of Trustees, and Ben said it was okay to unmute as well. I'm also a member of the Task Force on Public Safety, which reports directly to the President, that has been meeting every Monday evening. Marcelo and Derek and Sabrina, who are on this call as well, are members of that task force, and preliminary reports are being made. 2 points I want to make. One is that there is way more extensive training going on than we might think with our police officers. Now, does it mean that it covers everything that it needs to cover? That we don't know. And the second is to just point out that the college just hired 2 new officers, and both of them are of color. So the conversations that are going on are having some impact. Is that the be-all and the end-all? Is that the end of it? Of course, we're way far away from that. But there has been progress made, and we should point that out tonight.
Thank you, Kurt. I appreciate you stepping in and making everyone aware of that. All right. Does anybody have any other questions?
Marcel, we do have one. When going about implicit bias, how can one work on changing that?
Okay. Like I said earlier, we all have bias. And beginning to unpack what those biases are is the first step. So taking an implicit bias test to determine what that is. But then going further in, self-educating yourself on, what does this look like? What does it look like in society? How could I manage these biases that I have so that it doesn't harm any other person? And I guess doing some self-reflecting on yourself, and trying to figure out and determine who you are within a society and how you could impact other people. But that's kind of my answer for it. I don't know if anybody else, Tyson, Dr. Gibbons, Professor Gallardo.
There we go. I muted myself. So I just want to give a quick plug to the sociology department at Springfield College. I myself, my doctorate is in sociology. And so one of my specializations was race and ethnicity. So if you're interested in even just the basic aspects of what it actually means when we talk about race, and more specifically what we don't mean as well, definitely a good, simple introductory to sociology course I think is very helpful. Again, we have a very strong sociology department who I know will talk about those issues as well. And like I said, it's probably one of the reasons that I bring it into my classes as well. Just to briefly touch upon the training component, I apologize if it's off topic. I'm just looking at some of this reading that I have. In terms of where does that training kind of go or come from the recent numbers that I've seen, and we're talking about many different departments, it's about maybe a fifth of it is towards the use of force, meaning weapons training. About another fifth of it might be things like arrest, the actual process of arrest and things like that. And then another, when it comes to things like de-escalation training, it's a lot less. It's a lot less. And again, this goes back to the aspect of what we want, what we believe policing is, right? Unfortunately, for most people that go into policing, at least from the research that I've done, they believe it's, fighting crime, helping people by fighting crime, but that's not really the case. I make the joke that most of it is, not as exciting as getting, trees or getting cats out of trees, essentially, and it's small, disagreements between people. And And I think that in general, again, increasing the de-escalation, what that even means in general, is really important. Obviously, the first step I would say is acknowledging that that's even an issue to begin with, which again, it depends on who you are. I would say in terms of like departments, whether agreeing that's an issue or not. Again, today I would say that a lot of departments are focusing on this, or at least as Dr. Gibbons talked about, getting started, getting the conversation started, and see where they can go from there as well.
And Dr. Gallardo, I just want to mention and emphasize that de-escalation training. And I say that because I was a crisis negotiator on the state police for 14 years, was a team leader, and we responded to a lot of, I would say, a lot of events that took place, hostage situations, barricaded situations, and I think that this de-escalation training, the tactics that we use as negotiators brought the tension down to a certain level. And I always see an attorney here in federal court who always bring up the situation where his client, who was shooting at us, and how I de-escalated the situation, got this guy to calm down, come to reason, and then give up his weapon. But and he says that, but it's very important, de-escalation of the situation. My background was always investigations, so we try to de-escalate these situations, even when we were out there in gang enforcement. You try to de-escalate problems. And I think you bring that calm down, then it's you're able to reason, you're able to talk, you're able to get the individuals to start thinking about it. And but de-escalation training, and like I said, that's one of the things that IACP, International Association of Chiefs of Police, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. I'm a member of both. I'm on I'm on several committees, executive committees on both, and we're talking about de-escalation training. I mean, that's part of the reform. We need to do that. I'll also talk about, because we didn't talk about policies and some of the things that are out there in regards to policies and trainings and tactics. We have to reevaluate and change some of our use of force policies. We have to make sure that they're in line and updated. So these are things that are being done as well.
Thank you. I want to go back and acknowledge Ocean's question. She asked, do you think that most classes are taught from a white perspective, hence the lack of classes that teach real history, the social injustice in this country? Yeah, I mean, on college, we go to a predominantly white institution. Most classes are taught by white professors. And I think as long as professors are being truthful and accurate with the information they're providing to their students, I guess we'll have to settle for that. But ideally, it would be nice to see these classes taught by somebody who lived those experiences. Have to go about their days through the lens of a Black, Brown, Latino person. But that's something that we're continuing to fight for, to see more representation on campuses. But yeah, and Ocean, you could unmute yourself. I know you want to say something.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And I just one statement and just a question. My concern is, despite all the training, it is obvious that there's a serious racist problem within law enforcement. hence we see so many minorities being imprisoned longer and being imprisoned when they're innocent. And not just with law enforcement, but with the criminal justice system, with the justice system, even in the school system. I mean, in every system, racism exists, biases exist. You know, what's not so bad for a white person to do, it's horrific for a Latina or a marginalized person to do. And so, that's what's so, horrific. And I think it's really important. And that's why I asked the question. I mean, I know the answer, but I asked the question that when white people teach, that they're teaching from a white perspective, and we all have biases, known and unknown. And that ripples into everything, into every system. And so something more serious needs to be done within the police departments, within the criminal justice system, because it's broken. And it's been broken since the beginning of America. And so, when we talk about police reform, well, it should have been reformed a long time ago. And, and I just feel that, and I said this during the summer when we were having those great talks on anti-racism talks, and I'm so glad that we had these talks, that minorities' homes, like I'm talking about the homes within our bodies, are burning. And no one is finding it as important as if their physical home was burning. We just look at the stats, the criminal stats, right? We look at the poverty stats. We look at all the educational stats. It says SOS. And I think that the action is too lackadaisical. It's too put on the back burner. It's not an emergency. Well, it is an emergency. We've been in a state of emergency since the first black slave was brought over. And it needs to be really in the front. We take these classes, we're in class, and I'm going to say students that are marginalized. We're expected to perform, and I'm not saying that I'm not performing great, because I am, but I'm just saying, yesterday I learned this word. It's called invisible labor. The invisible labor of a marginalized person. We're always tackling something extra. We always carry this extra burden. And I just feel like the injustices really need to be talked about. Biden, through, from the president all the way down to parents. So I just wanted to make that statement. And I just hope that the police department, they realize that it's a state of emergency. You need to root out racist police officers. They need to be taken off. They should not be a police officer if they're racist. If they've had one incident, they need to be retrained and proven, and they need to prove themselves. Okay, because no one needs to be confronted by a overly biased, racist cop. And any person, no one needs to be able. No one should be. Their livelihood should not be, compromised because of a racist person. Period. And that's all I have to say. Thank you for allowing me to speak.
Hey, thank you.
I was going to say, on top of that, it's interesting you talk about the invisible burden. That's the problem that we talk about a lot, especially in school from an early age. The only thing you really hear about Black people of color is slavery and then the civil rights. And that's really it. People don't understand all the other things that happen in between those times and beyond that has affected people of color. And it's often left to us. And as a person of color, I'm the one who's forced to have that conversation constantly over and over and over again, trying to explain or I have to be the person in the classroom, the one black person, the one black perspective, even though that's not really fair because all black people and people are different. So I definitely understand what you mean when you say that invisible burden and trying to get people to understand how black people and people of color have been struggling for a while now.
Thank you for that. And, the emotional burden in which BIPOC people experience, particularly black and brown individuals, is just completely, it's, words can't put into, words can't describe, how the black and brown people are feeling with the current climate of the U.S. And, the hope is that we could only progress from here and hope that, we move in that right direction. But, it's, unfortunately, it's a waiting game, and we just have to continue doing our parts in making this world a better place and hope to finally see some change someday.